Good afternoon. Welcome to the IPDAY webinar, High Impact Indicators Across the Content Areas, a Thematic Approach. Part 1, Reasoning Through Language Arts and Social Studies. This training event is supported with federal funds as appropriated to the Florida Department of Education, Division of Career and Adult Education, for the provision of state leadership professional development activities. My name is Ann Morgan, and I'm the Adult Education Coordinator and AGE Grant Manager for Pinellas County Schools CTAE Department. I'm very excited to be with you today to discuss our topic. A few housekeeping items first. You should be able to see our question and answer screen. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and I will answer them as we go along if I can, and also at the end of the presentation. Today's presentation is being recorded, so encourage your colleagues to access it on the IPDAY website. It should be available within 48 hours. Today's objectives. In this session, we will explore integration of the RLA high impact indicators with related indicators in social studies. Since we're now implementing TABE 11 and 12, the amount of curriculum we're asking our teachers to cover has increased dramatically as we integrate the CCR standards into our ABE and GED classrooms. This new material, added to the higher rigor of the GED 2014 exam, has made it necessary for teachers to try using an approach that incorporates multiple skill and content areas into their daily instruction. In the webinar today, you will learn about the process we're using in Pinellas County, a thematic approach to teaching the high impact indicators with related indicators. In this first session, we will explore how we're able to expand the usefulness and effectiveness of this process to teach related standards and objectives from ABE language and reading with similar GED indicators in reading language arts and social studies. In a few weeks, we will continue with part 2 of this webinar, which will focus on related indicators from science and mathematical reasoning. You know, of course, one of the best parts of any IPDAY webinar are the resources you receive to share with colleagues. So included in your handouts today is a workbook with some sample resources to get you started. You've probably heard the term thematic approach or multidisciplinary teaching before, and may even already use it in your daily instruction. Knowing that often we have just a short window of time to prepare our students for the GED exam, college or career entry, this approach can give you more bang for the buck and demonstrate to students how interrelated the curriculum knowledge and skills they need to acquire can be. So what are some of the advantages of the thematic approach? Interdisciplinary, interrelated instruction across academic disciplines. We're able to combine the standards and content from TABE 11 and 12 and the indicators from the GED exam, which really expands the opportunities for teaching skills that cross over more curriculum. Learning under thematic approach is less fragmented and more connected. This approach allows literacy skills to grow progressively, so you can add more content as you go along. This is especially good for our lower level ABE students who can learn as they go and add more. Allowing adult learners to associate new information holistically with their own experiences. Thematic instruction assumes students learn best when they can associate new information across the entire curriculum and with their own lives, experiences, and communities. And of course, adult learners are especially adept at this because they already have many connections built up and information and knowledge. And finally, it also helps students to broaden and deepen their skills in a shorter time frame. It helps those students at that ABE level who, while they're learning ABE curriculum, will also be learning some GED level skills at the same time. And that's going to make that ABE to GED transition much easier and quicker. So our first steps. I thought we could use a little winter reminder today. They tell me we have a cold front coming in this weekend, so we're hoping for that. Open up the windows. But first thing, you're going to select that theme or skill that's relevant and necessary to student success. We're going to decide what is that thematic unit, skill, or objective we're trying to teach. Research standards, objectives, and lessons that relate to the identified skill and can be applied in multiple context areas. For this webinar, we're going to examine the college and career readiness standards that relate to TABE 1112, reading and language, the RLA, high impact indicators identified by the GED testing service, as well as other related indicators from the GED test. And then finally, you want to design lessons that incorporate those real world opportunities for students to engage with under the thematic approach. One way to do this is by using informational texts and practice and sample questions from the GED and TABE 11 and 12 exams, which then will ensure our resources are relevant and applicable. So, always throw in a little funny here. Our little guy from Mr. Woodhead says we have to learn this stuff because it's on the test. That's it? That's the only reason? Just because it's on the test? Thank goodness. I thought I was missing some greater meaning. And we're going to look at why these standards and indicators and objectives are so important. Where did they come from? Where did the blueprints for TABE originate? Where did the GED assessment targets originate? Let's review. I'm sure that most of you are familiar by now with the 2011 College and Career Readiness Standards for Adult Education. Found on the Links Ed Government website, they present a set of college and career readiness standards that reflect the content most relevant to preparing adult students for success in colleges, technical training programs, work and citizenship, and now are adopted in some form by the majority of states and by OCTAE, the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education. Of course, the philosophy underlining the GED test is that there is a core of academic skills and content knowledge that must be acquired in order for an adult to be prepared to enter a job, a training program, or that entry-level credit-bearing post-secondary course. The GED assessment targets are derived from these college and career readiness standards. Similarly, the TABE blueprints are also based on the OCTAE college and career readiness standards. The reading content reflects mature life and work-related situations and highlights overlapping objectives, from word meaning skills to critical thinking skills, while items from the language blueprint are presented in meaningful contexts that reflect the writing process as it applies in life. So, since both the TABE and the GED have been based on similar standards, it really lends itself to our thematic approach. Let's look at some of these blueprints. If you haven't had a chance to go, they are on tabe.com, and they have the blueprints for every level and every subject. This first one is the reading blueprints, levels D and A. And both of them have a high emphasis level on the TABE test. The level D, delineate and evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, assessing whether the reasoning is sound and the evidence is relevant and sufficient, and recognize when irrelevant evidence is introduced. Level A adds the ability to identify false statements and fallacious reasoning with a high emphasis as well. Do these sound familiar? Let's look at some of the assessment targets on the GED exam. Also, we have the language blueprints. We have two of them, and just to show you that, as well as reading and language, both have standards that talk about evidence. The level D here with, again, a high emphasis in the TABE, write arguments to support claims with clear reasons and relevant evidence. Level A, language, goes a bit farther and adds using valid reasoning and sufficiency of evidence. Even the level M blueprint, which isn't shown here, also incorporates similar standards with the following: write opinion pieces on topics or texts supporting a point of view with reasons and information or evidence. So here's one of our GED assessment targets. Let's see how those relate. Here's an example for reading from Reasoning Through Language Arts. Note that 8.3 and 8.6 both deal with evaluating the relevance and sufficiency of evidence offered in support of a claim, and identifying an underlying premise or assumption in an argument, and evaluating the logical support and evidence provided. Both of these have been identified as GED high impact indicators on the exam. And look at the similarity to the TABE blueprints we just looked at. Here's more GED assessment targets, this time from the RLA, writing. And again, writing 1, determine the details of what's explicitly stated. And writing 2 mentions developing claims with well-chosen examples, facts, details, in other words, evidence. And then my personal favorite, of course, the other part of the GED RLA, the constructed response. Trait 1 is titled Creation of Arguments and the Use of Evidence. In order to score a 2, which is what we want our students to do, notice that they have to cite relevant and specific evidence from source text to support argument, may include few pieces of evidence, and analyze the issue or evaluate the validity of the argumentation within the source text. So it's on the reading GED assessment target, on the writing, and also on the constructed response. So now let's look at one of the related indicators to RLA, which would be social studies. Do we have some evidence finding in those assessment targets? Those were the assessment targets for the other 2, and here we go. In particular, social studies practice SSP 7 asks students to distinguish among fact, opinion, and reasoned judgment in a document, and B, distinguish between unsupported claims and informed hypothesis grounded in social studies evidence. So I talked about the high impact indicators. I mentioned them, and most of you are probably familiar with them now, but let's talk about them for just a minute. We've actually used these for some projects and to create lesson plans here in Pinellas. And they were featured in a IPDA webinar last year, and there's some lesson plans and resources already available on the IPDA website that target high impact indicators. They describe the critical thinking skills essential to test taker success. They may currently receive light coverage during GED test preparation, but they do lend themselves to straightforward instruction. They represent the foundational skills that are the basis for the development of other skills covered in the GED assessment targets and can be applied in multiple contexts. So these are just perfect to do a thematic approach. They can be taught very easily and will certainly give us that more bang for the buck that we're looking for in that limited time frame for instruction. Here's 2 that we're going to look at today from the RLA, both, as I said, high impact indicators. R83, evaluate the relevance and sufficiency of evidence offered in support of a claim. And R86, identify an underlying premise or assumption in an argument and evaluate the logical support and evidence provided. And here's our social studies high impact indicator. Determine the central ideas or information of a primary or secondary source, corroborating or challenging conclusions with evidence. So perhaps you're starting to see my theme coming up. For social studies, they need to locate a single piece of evidence in a text, multiple pieces of evidence in a text. They need to differentiate between relevant and irrelevant evidence, and they need to use evidence to support or challenge an author's conclusion. So here I added another related indicator, and again you can see how evidence seems to show up in just about every single area of the GED and the TABE for that matter. Now we spend some time looking at the different standards and indicators. Here's our pattern. We're going to use something about evidence in our thematic approach. So why should we use these high impact indicators and related indicators in instruction? Remember, we want standards and indicators that lend themselves to thematic teaching. They address the maximum number of skills in a limited time. They allow students to apply skills in multiple ways, and they can be used in a variety of contexts across all GED content areas. And that's why I did spend a little time today showing you how they do seem to appear in each one of the assessment targets. So how are we going to do this? How do we integrate these into the RLA indicators with related indicators in social studies? Remember, once we have taught the skills of identifying, analyzing, and evaluating evidence for an RLA constructed response, for example, those same skills will help students in answering questions on TABE 11 and 12 and the GED social studies exam. In addition, learning about the content and themes in social studies will help them when writing a constructed response involving those topics. And I know many of the samples I've seen on the GED website, they are on historical documents or passages that deal with geography or government. So, you know, let's look at what we've got in social studies and how we can use that when students are writing a constructed response for the RLA. Remember, we always want to use that thematic approach to integrate multiple content areas, and we're going to select those related indicators to maximize skill practice. So these are the two that we're going to talk about today. We chose the 8.3 from the RLA, evaluate the relevance and sufficiency of evidence offered in support of a claim, and the social studies practice 7B, distinguish among fact, opinion, and reasoned judgment in a primary or secondary source document. Let's see how we can connect these two. Here's a shot of the social studies focusing themes, and again, this can be found on the GED website, which has a wealth of information about the social studies themes and content areas. This is actually from the assessment guide for social studies. The focusing themes shown here, development of modern liberties and democracy and dynamic responses in societal systems, have been designed to ensure that the test covers a wide range of important concepts and ideas in social studies, and that the focus is placed on distinct subsets of ideas within each topic. Content that falls outside these themes is not tested on the social studies test. So if you don't see it here, it's not on the test. Another good piece of paper for students to look at. They worry about, what is this on the test? Is that on the test? If it's not on this, it's not on the test, according to the GED people. So of those themes, we have content areas, 4 of them, which I'm sure you're pretty familiar with. Of course, the largest one is the civics and government, which comprises half of the exam, 50%. So topics that are within that, and that's a lot of the things that we see on the GED or constructed response, something for government or something for history, which is the next one. Although U.S. history only comprises 20% of the topics, it is generally used in many times for that constructed response. So we want to be sure that students are familiar with what's comprised in that U.S. history. The third one, of course, is economics, a little smaller emphasis here, 15%. Sometimes, though, this seems like one that students are more interested in because it deals with money and business. And finally, the last 15% would be in the geography. Particularly today, we were going to look at the GB5, which is human changes to the environment. And we're going to look at a constructed response that deals with that kind of topic. So that 8.3 that we've identified that we're going to talk about today, let's look a little closer at that. Do you notice that evidence appears in every single skill listed? There's 7, and every one of them has the word evidence in it. So this is a very important skill, and it seems like it would be a great fit to combine social studies and constructed response. So what about evidence? I mean, you know, it seems like evidence should be pretty easy for our students to find, but one of the things that's come out of some of the data that the GED testing service has released is on that constructed response, students seem to have a little bit of trouble sometimes picking out evidence, deciding if evidence is good or bad evidence, and whether it supports the claim, which of course is what we want them to do on a constructed response. I liked this quote from Dennis Hayes: "Evidence isn't the same as proof. Whereas evidence allows for professional judgment, proof is absolute and incontestable." So just because something is deemed as evidence doesn't mean that it's actually proof of things, but you know, it's something we want to look at, and we're going to dig deeper, and we're going to see how we can help students determine whether evidence is good, bad, or ugly. This is a great little graphic, and I included it in your workbook. It's on page 2 of your workbook, and it's a nice thing to share with students to kind of show them what the different types of evidence are that they're going to find in their passages. At its most basic, evidence is something that can be perceived with the senses. Factual evidence can be proven, or are statements that have been accepted as fact. Students often confuse facts and claims. That is because facts can be claims in one context, or start out as claims, and once proven with evidence become facts. So it's no wonder it's a little confusing. In a well-written constructed response, you should be able to tell the difference between a claim and the factual evidence used to support it. If it is difficult to tell the difference between claims and facts, it could be a sign of a badly supported claim, one that uses faulty evidence or reasoning. Factual evidence might also include documentary evidence from letters, diaries, laws, etc. Statistics or data includes numbers, percentages, or measurement. I think most of our students can usually discern when statistics or data is included. Anecdotes, example of anecdotes, real life experiences, individual stories, anecdotal accounts that help explain an author's claim. This type of evidence is sometimes viewed negatively, as if one person's experiences might not be representative of others or is skewed by one's personal perspective. But depending on the event, this can be useful and an applicable type of evidence. Expert testimony, this includes specialized knowledge, not common knowledge, usually gleaned through formal training or experiences, used often in court proceedings as evidence. And I think most students would be able to tell that there's something going on there when they hear, you know, somebody talk about being in court and they call the expert in to testify. Logical reasoning is an explanation which draws conclusions that the reader can understand and allows them to make sense from the facts. And lastly, emotional appeal. This is the use of sympathy, fear, loyalty to persuade and manipulate the reader's emotions. Students may have seen a lot of this lately in political discourse or the onslaught of political ads that we saw in the last couple of weeks and months. Although quite effective in swaying people's opinions, this is generally not thought of as the best type of evidence to use to prove a claim. I see that we have a question. Is there a constructed response in GED social studies test? I thought this had been discontinued in 2016. Yes, that's actually true, but probably what I was referring to more was the fact that the constructed response on RLA many times uses social studies themes or content areas. So they may not necessarily, they're not writing a constructed response for social studies, but the topic that they get in RLA could very well be related to a social studies area. It's a good question. Let me close this answered. Okay. So once you've defined the types of evidence, which we did in a passage or a document, one must also assess the evidence by analyzing and evaluating whether it's usable in a constructed response or to answer one of those questions on another part of the GED or the TABE test. Let's look at ways to analyze and evaluate the suitability of evidence in informational text. Analyzing. First, let's talk about claims and evidence. In order to analyze evidence, examine the claim and the evidence that supports it. As mentioned before, evidence is comprised of concrete facts that you can verify, you can observe with your five senses. It could be an experimental result, a natural process, documented writings, or something else observable. A claim, on the other hand, is an idea, an assertion, or a hypothesis that has multiple sides requiring support or evidence to be accepted. Now, a good way to help students analyze the evidence in a passage is to break the task into smaller steps. First, identify the claim in the passage or the point the author is stressing. Next, identify the evidence in the passage that supports that claim. Finally, how does the evidence selected relate to the claim or hypothesis? This is where that second step in the assessment of evidence comes in, evaluating. So when evaluating the sufficiency of evidence, and this is another thing our students struggle with sometimes, generally the more factual evidence you have to support your claim, the better. When a survey, for instance, provides a certain amount of evidence, but many things can affect it. Sample size, for one. 100 people surveyed as opposed to 1,000. Or the varying degrees or different types of people included. Was it a survey that was 16 to 24-year-olds or a wider range? Or income. Distribution of participants in the study determines the sufficiency of the facts provided. The types of evidence we saw a few slides back included data and statistics, expert testimony, factual statements, etc. The more different types of evidence that you saw listed there, the stronger the case you can make for your claim. One caveat, though, it's sometimes easier to determine that there's not enough evidence available or that what is there is irrelevant and insufficient to adequately support a claim. So we need to teach students to think about how much evidence is in the passage, how many separate facts there are, and whether the evidence feels like enough to support the claim adequately. The relevance of a claim is usually the easiest to determine if students don't get distracted by the facts that they see. Often a passage will yield some absolutely 100% accurate information, but it's totally unrelated to the claim or the questions at hand. Also, students often see numbers or statistics and think they have good evidence, but it could be confusing or misleading and does not demonstrate a correlation or relationship to the claim. They need to be able to state why that evidence is relevant. Representative evidence is that which is typical or encompasses the majority of the data included. One example to demonstrate this to students might be the evaluation of the monthly average temperature in a Florida summer. You could say the lowest temperature between May and September was 56 degrees, while the high was 98.6. But most of the time during the summer, temperatures ranged from 88 to 92. And we live in Florida, we know that's true. That would be the temperature range most representative of a Florida summer temperature, not the 56 or the 98 that we saw before. So another part of what we were looking at was the facts, opinions, reasoned judgment. Students will probably be familiar with the difference between fact and opinion, but you may want to give them a little practice to be sure they have a good understanding and are able to identify both in a passage or a document. In your workbook, pages 3 to 5, we've included an activity that we actually adapted from Miami-Dade College. So if there's any of you Miami folks there on the call, we've taken your fact and opinion sheet and we're using it today. We did give you credit, however, so I hope that's okay. You personally, this is a great Word document. You could even pull out and put some other social studies or science facts and opinions and give the students some extra practice at determining those things. So here's an example from my GED study guide. This is a sample GED question. Fact, as we have already mentioned, can be verified by the senses or comes with someone with the skills and knowledge to be an expert in the field, or are presented in an objective manner with no obvious bias, so that the students can determine if facts can be trusted. Opinions, shown above, includes words or phrases or feelings rather than objective facts that can be verified or proven. Clue words for students to opinion might include things like safe, dangerous, evil, attractive, probably, always, perhaps, usually. There's quite a few that signal opinion rather than fact. This is a question, and we didn't actually have the whole passage, but you can see the question says, in January 1999, President George Bush made a speech about Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Which statement from President Bush's speech is an opinion? And you can see the answer here is, we've seen all too often in this century how quickly any threat to one becomes a threat to all. It's a nice statement, but it's not a fact. It's an opinion, and probably a reasoned one, but nevertheless, the other A, B, and C options could certainly be proven and would be more in the fact range. Here's one, that was a GED one. Here's one from a Level D TABE. This again is from TABE.com in their sample questions section. And again, I didn't include the paragraph, but just to show you, it says, which sentence from the passage best expresses the author's attitude toward the threat of quicksand? It's number 4. And now that they should be able to pretty much pick out. An attitude is not a fact. It's an opinion. So you can see answer D uses the clue word attitude. Experience with quicksand usually is more messy and embarrassing than it is dangerous. That dangerous was even one of those words that I had researched that they said is used a lot for opinion. So in messy, embarrassing, what embarrasses one person might not embarrass someone else. So again, you can see these kind of fact and opinion questions are on both the GED and TABE 11-12. To help students separate facts and opinions, we do have, as I said, that little activity in your workbook, but we've also included some great graphic organizers. This one is actually called I Can Classify Facts and Opinions. It's from the Polk Brothers Foundation Center for Urban Education. And I have the website listed on the graphic organizer there in your workbook. But it helps students list and organize their facts and opinions, and even gives them a couple of other examples of looking for bias. So we talked about facts and opinions. The third part of that social studies practice was reasoned judgment. The social studies indicator SSP7 asks for students to be able to identify reasoned judgment. These should not be judgments based on emotional reactions, and if so, should be avoided as there's really no validity to them. Reasoned judgments simply exist to maintain a belief, to create a meaningful representation of something. They may not always be true, but there's enough data or information to support the conclusion you're using to craft that constructive response or to answer the question. So sometimes I even think of it as the common man question. Is this something that the average person would say, yes, this makes sense. Yes, this is probably true. That's going to be a reasoned judgment. And of course, again, should never be based on emotional responses, things like that. Here's another example of a GED practice question that asks students to make inferences or draw conclusions by applying logic and reasoning skills. So many times students will be looking for that hard data, that fact, and it's really not in the passage. But again, they're asking them to use reasoned judgment and draw a conclusion based on what's in there and what they know. In this case, they're saying, which quotation from the article allows a reader to infer that the power of the U.S. government is limited? And the answer is the U.S. Constitution included safeguards to protect individual rights against abuse by the government. So again, a common man kind of scenario where the average person would probably agree with that statement. Another thing that's in your workbook is a great one to use with social studies. It's called a historical thinking chart. And I actually found it on the Stanford History Education website, which I've got that citation listed at the end of your workbook under the social studies websites and resources. It's a great way to get them to kind of think about things. It's a good introduction to questions students should ask themselves when judging a source. The chart, along with an activity on evaluating sources, are on pages 8 through 12. So you might want to take a look at those. Another great source for materials to use for practice with these skills is located on the GED website. And I know probably everybody on this call has been there, but you know, I go on there maybe once a month or twice a month, and most of the time when I go on there, I find something that wasn't there before is kind of new. This is, like I said, under the teacher resources and free classroom materials section. It's a sample extended response for classroom practice. For this activity, we're choosing a prompt on game-based learning, and that again is in your workbook. There's 2 prompts. They're on pages 19 to 21. Using what we've learned about identifying and analyzing and evaluating evidence for relevance and sufficiency, let's look at some graphic organizers students can use as a beginning step to writing that constructed response. This one is a great one for evidence, and this is actually the one that is filled out in your workbook based on those 2 prompts, sample prompts for the constructed response. It's on pages 14 to 18, these organizers. This one's called Both Sides Now. It works well to help students separate evidence that supports and opposes their claim. We use this one as a sample in your workbook, as I mentioned. Another popular one, pros and cons. I know that I used one very similar to this with pros and cons when I was in the classroom. My students loved that. I think something about the words pros and cons, but it's pretty easy for them to follow. You might want to remind the students that, you know, they're not going to be allowed to take this nice little printed pros and cons organizer into the test with them, but you practice in the classroom, and once you've done that, this could be adapted by them by just drawing a line down their scratch board that they use when they're writing and organizing their writing. And you know, one side could have pros, one side can have cons, and they just start listing it. And again, from the research that the GED data is telling us, is that students have a hard time organizing that. And this is just something that's a line down the middle with pros on one side and cons on the other, and something I think that most students would find pretty easy to use. Another one, improving an argument. Again, asking for evidence that the writers included to support the position. And another one, improving an argument. What, why, and how can be used to improve an argument and organize the evidence from a passage by asking the students for the reasons why they're using that particular piece of evidence to support their claim. And finally, this is another one from the Polk Brothers Foundation Center for Urban Education, and that site is listed on your website list. I just kind of like the way this was lined out, and talking about supporting reasons and facts on each side. One position, another position. Not necessarily pro or con, just this is the one, this is the other one. And I tell students when you get done filling those out, You decide which one has the stronger claim, which of course, again, is exactly what we want them to do on the test. So, a few teaching tips to get started. Using informational or nonfiction text for practicing the skills attached to this standard. Select a text that contains a viewpoint the author wants to convince the reader to accept. You know, it's great sometimes to use articles from the paper, but again, you're going to have ones that either present an argumentative viewpoint or something that students will be able to glean data or evidence from. So that's the thing that's going to give them the best practice. It is very possible that when students have analyzed and evaluated an argument, they find that they remain unconvinced. That's normal. The purpose of this practice is to teach them to become aware of when the author tries to convince them of something and to be ready to analyze the quality of the argument. Consider finding 2 or 3 articles that present opposing viewpoints for students to read. And you can find those samples at GED.com or IPDAY, of course. Assessment and extensions. You know, I know most of our classrooms have students with varying levels of understanding. So for some of those lower level ABE students, you know, it's pretty difficult to hand them 2 prompts and ask them to look at the one and pull out the evidence and look at the other and pull out the evidence and put them in the graphic organizer. And, you know, you may want to start out by just letting them use underline and highlight evidence in a paragraph and then gradually work towards an entire passage. You can set students up in groups. And actually, we recently did a IPDAY training where we had, you know, 35 teachers in a room, and we put them in groups and we gave them highlighters and we had them take one prompt to the other and write them out. And I think they had a lot of fun doing that. But that's something you're going to work up to with those lower level students. And you need to have the students, when they're in those groups, ask each other questions. Things like, okay, you put that down as evidence. What kind of evidence is that? Let's look at our types of evidence handout. Is that factual? Is it emotional appeal? Is it fact? Is it opinion? Is it relevant to the topic? And is it of sufficient amount to be considered useful? Could you possibly use reasoned judgment to make inferences as to the truthfulness of that evidence? Again, there's a lot of things going on right now. Just you could pull out from the newspaper. I know I use Newsella quite a bit when I was in the classroom. I'm sure a lot of you do also. They have pretty timely topics that are important to our students, which might make it a little easier for them to be getting involved with the evidence. So a lot of resources that you can use. And of course, as you know, IPDAY is always the way to go with those kind of things. So today we've talked a lot about evidence, about how the RLA and social studies indicators are related, how the standards are the same on the TABE blueprints as they are in the GED assessment targets, that using this thematic approach can actually shorten up the time that we're using. So next time, in about 2 weeks, 2 weeks from today, we're going to have the second part of this webinar, which is going to be integrating the science and mathematical reasoning and how those related indicators are also part of our thematic unit. We're going to look at how they can find evidence in science, how they can find evidence in mathematical reasoning, and then you'll have a nice set of activities that you can use to teach that evidence theme that we're focusing on this time. So that brings us up to our question and answers. I know there was a lot of information to absorb today, and I just wanted to see if there's any. I don't see any in our Q&A box right now, but I'm going to give you about a minute. And if you want to plug something in. We'll try and answer it. So I'm not seeing any questions today. That's fine. You can always email me a question if you think of one later. Please just take a minute and give us some feedback and a survey. While we're looking at that, I've got a few questions. Kay asks, has there been a recent ruling from the Florida Department of Education about integrating TABE with GED? Well, I can tell you, Kay, on a personal level, I here in Pinellas am collecting data. I know that there's some disconnect between those two, and we're working on getting some evidence together that we can present and show that there may be some kind of a misalignment, perhaps, with those higher levels of TABE, the 5 and 6, and GED readiness. So we are working on that. To my knowledge, there isn't any information on that yet. But I know that some districts, I think, have just started using TABE 11 and 12, or they can still use 9 and 10 until December 31st. So let's see what transpires on that. But we're looking at that, and we're waiting to try and get some rulings on that. Melissa, what ways would you encourage teachers to use graphic organizers? That's a good point, and I always loved them because I think most of our students are visually oriented, and a graphic organizer is good even if you're, tactily stimulated. It gives them something. And as I said, practice using them in the classrooms, but then show them how they can just draw a line down a piece of paper and have pros on one side, cons on the other. And that kind of helps. So other than putting them on their desk and saying, use these, that's always encouraging. So, do I see any other questions? No. Yes. Oh, I do have one from Randy. This presentation is available to anyone who has an IFDA account. Yes, it is. They are on there. It is listed, and the whole thing will be available within 48 hours, but it is on the IFDA website, as is the workbook. Okay, and I think that takes us up to the end. And there's my contact information if you need it. Just email me, shoot me a phone call, and I'll be glad to help you with any questions you might have that we didn't get answered. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.